Hey, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. I'm sure you are used to seeing me here. So we are here for another awesome success story. I will be welcoming Winslow in a second, but a couple notes to mention before we get started is first and foremost, if you like the interview, make sure to comment or like it because we want to make sure that this is helpful for you. And secondly, as we speak here live, over at TTP, we are updating our current GMAT course to add in the GMAT Focus edition of our course. So if you're using TTP, you'll get free access to it. If you're not using TTP, but you're considering the GMAT Focus, you can check that out. You'll have access to both for free, and that will also happen during your 5-day trial. So it's worth checking out. It can help you start making some decisions moving forward, and hopefully Winslow's advice here can also help you with some of those decisions. So I want to welcome in Winslow. As you can see, he scored a 770 on the GMAT. That's ridiculous. And even more ridiculous is he scored a verbal 51. I don't think you can do any better. And a Quant 47, which is awesome as well. So welcome, Winslow. Thanks for coming today.
Thanks for having me, Jeff.
All right, cool. So we can jump in. And one other thing to mention is if you guys have questions during this, like feel free to ask during the discussion here today, because I want them to be relevant to what we're discussing at the time, and we'll stop to answer those questions. So I guess the first thing that'll give everybody some context, Winslow, for you is why don't you talk about your background a little bit so they can kind of see where you're at, where you're headed, and things like that.
Yeah, sure. So I graduated from the University of Vermont in 2019 with a BS in business administration, and then commissioned directly into the Army, where I've been an Army officer for just about 4 years now. So I've got about 6 months left in the Army, and I'm looking to apply to a full-time MBA program in starting the fall of 2024. So probably like a lot of people in the Army and in the civilian world, like I didn't really know what I wanted to do for a long time. I think a lot of people think you're going to have this idea of like, oh, this is going to be my dream career. You know, that wasn't the case for me. I just kind of decided, well, I got to pursue something. I know that business school is a good way to career pivot, started learning more about the industries that I could potentially pivot into. And I realized that the GMAT was going to be the obvious first step to tackling that obstacle. So started studying in January, trying to give myself a lot of time. Kind of wish I started earlier, to be honest, but it was a decent amount of time. And that was kind of the thought process. Once I started going, I just kind of committed to it.
Got it. Yeah. And that is an important point you made. I think that especially when we're, finishing undergrad and starting our careers, I mean, we're young at that point, right? And we do our best in those 4 years to figure out what we want to do, but it doesn't always come to fruition like that. So business school is a great way to pivot. It sounds like you did do some research too. So it's not as if you're just taking the GMAT, applying to business school, and then winging it. It sounds like you have a really good idea of what you want to do with your MBA, which is clearly going to be important when you start your applications this fall. So I think that's pretty good advice. So anyone who's in that situation, like, it's a process, right? I guess your thought was maybe I'll take the GMAT, study for the GMAT, and concurrently do some research on the things you might want to do following business school. Is that kind of how it went?
Yeah, absolutely. I was always drawn to something like management consulting. I learned through my time in the military that I really enjoy working on small teams with diverse, ambiguous problem sets. That's something that played to my natural strengths, and I also enjoyed doing. So a career like that really appealed to me. And also the opportunity to go back to school, take academics more seriously, make those close bonds that a lot of us don't have an easy time making in the civilian world, when oftentimes you're kind of either at the mercy of who you're working with, or where you happen to be in the U.S. or if it's abroad. So kind of looking forward to that experience for many different ways. Yeah.
And did you reach out to people in these industries or just kind of do some of your own independent research?
Yeah, I've got actually one of my cousins is in management consulting, and I have a lot of friends at a variety of business schools. So I was lucky to have a lot of advice along the way, and to know a lot of people who worked in these industries or went through the business school process, and not a single one regretted it. Everybody was pretty enthusiastic and kind of telling me, "You have to do this. You'd love it." Knowing me and my personality too, so it made sense from the start. I just wasn't really fully bought in until I started the GMAT prep, and then I realized this is actually a really good move for me, and it's what I want to do. So
Right.
it took a while to get there, but I think that's relatively normal. I mean, some people know from a young age. For me, kind of took me a while, but I'm happy with where I'm headed right now.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it usually people takes time for people to figure that out. And yes, this is a great segue. So your GMAT, you rocked it, obviously, 770. Why don't you talk about how you got started with your GMAT prep and like what basically what that decision process looked like? Because clearly there's a lot you could do as far as prepping for the GMAT. So yeah, why don't you walk people through that a little bit?
Absolutely. So, like a lot of people, I was most nervous about the quant section. I didn't really know much about the GMAT, so I was researching the sections. I've never been particularly strong in quant, and I don't think I'd consider myself a naturally gifted standardized test taker, probably somewhere in the middle. So I did a lot of research about the GMAT, and I knew from the start that I needed a comprehensive program. What I mean by that is a program that really like starts from the ground up, from the lowest level, and just walks you through in baby steps. So I did a lot of research, and a lot of what I was seeing online on social media, Reddit articles about it was you need to take, or they recommended taking a cold mock just to see like your baseline ability. And I know some people score pretty highly. I think my first mock was like a 500 or a 510. So obviously pretty
Yeah.
poor. You know, that score is not going to raise any eyebrows pretty much anywhere. So, and both sections, of course, with that score were pretty weak. Quant was weaker, but my verbal was in the 30s for sure. And so through a lot of Googling and what I was reading on social media, a lot of people were recommending target test prep. So I saw that there was like a $1 for a 5 day trial or $5 for one day. I can't remember what it was, but I
Yep.
decided to try it out. And immediately I kind of knew that it was going to be the right choice just because I was able to look through all the chapters, look through all the lessons. I saw it was extremely extensive, which I know is daunting for some people. I was definitely worried about how long it was going to take, but I also knew like if I was going to learn these concepts, I needed to be taught from the ground up. I couldn't just skip around or have something that confused me. To me, it looked very, very logical and straightforward. So it didn't really take long for me to decide on TTP, to be honest.
Good. Yeah. I mean, the 5 day trial is full access. I think yes, it's $1 for 5 days, not the other way around, which is nice.
Yeah.
But it's full access. So as you did, and many students do, you had a chance to really see it at its fullest, right? It wasn't limited. You could see, as you said, teaching from the ground up. I use that terminology a lot. I mean, that is truly what we do. Anyone who like yourself who has no GMAT experience or limited GMAT experience can come in and really learn this stuff. So it's a testament that you basically went from having to relearn math to getting a Q47 when it's all said and done. Um, and Yeah, that's definitely an amazing feat. And one thing worth mentioning too, that you kind of said is that initial practice test score. Now you could have said to yourself, you know what, I'm nervous. I don't want to see a crappy score, so why bother, right? And people do that. But the thing is, if you don't do it, um, you're never going to be able to track that improvement, right? So had you not done it and then gotten to the end of your prep, and let's say your first practice exam, you score a 670, and we'll get into that shortly, you'd say, okay, well, that's pretty nice, but what does that really mean for what I did over, X number of months? So for anyone watching this, keep that in mind. Don't be scared of that first practice exam. Take it, get your baseline score, and then dive into whatever prep you're using. And as far as TTP is concerned, did you follow the study plan from beginning to end, doing everything that we ask you to do within that study plan?
By and large, yes. I would say when I got towards the very end, especially with like reading comprehension and critical reasoning, I was definitely moving faster. I wasn't necessarily reading everything, but what was key for me, especially with like sentence correction and the first, let's say, 2/3 roughly of the quant, was doing absolutely everything, especially when it came to massive chapters like properties of numbers, the
Yeah.
fundamentals that you're tested on. And, something like properties of numbers in the real GMAT, for those that have taken like the official mocks, it's like you'll have at least, 8 or 10 questions that are somewhat related to that. So you really do have to master those concepts. And I knew
Yeah.
that going in. So while it was very frustrating, you see how slowly you're making progress in the grand scheme of things. I would always try to refocus myself on like what I'm doing presently and try to get through it as thoroughly as I could. Obviously, some people are going to have time restrictions, and I definitely ran into that a little bit at the end. I had to speed up, but at that point, I'd spent so much time learning the fundamentals that it was becoming to be a lot easier. It was coming easier to me. So I would say probably about 80 to 90%, I followed the whole thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's exciting too. I mean, when you start from a level of just foundational knowledge and then you start to work through this stuff and you're getting questions right on practice exams. I mean, it's a really cool feeling to be like, oh wow, the growth is actually there. And I'm sure you clearly noticed that as you were working through the course. Um, as far as your timeline, what did that look like? Like beginning to end, well, I guess with TTP and then obviously your whole GMAT prep experience, which was mostly TTP, but what was that like?
Yeah. So I started beginning of January this year. And then I took my one and only official GMAT on June 20th or 21st. So just about 6 months. And the TTP modules recommend about, I think, 1 to 2 hours during the weekdays, and then really as much as you can feasibly do 3 to 4, maybe more, however many quality hours you can get in during the weekend. And I try to abide by that. Obviously, being in the Army, there's a lot of lack of predictability. Some
Right.
weeks are better than others, but I would always try to get an hour done sometime in the morning. I have to start work at about 6 or 6:30, so it would usually be between when our physical training ends and the workday begins. That's when I would get my 1 hour in. Sometimes I would be able to take lunch, oftentimes not, but sometimes I would study 30 minutes to 45 minutes at lunch. And then I would try when I got home during the week as well. But that oftentimes, anyone who's studied for any period of time knows, like, your brain's tired, and oftentimes you just close the laptop because you're like, I'm not really getting anything out of it. And when you're trying to learn new concepts, you do have to be somewhat in a fresh state of mind. So I was kind of chugging away about 10 hours a week, maybe 15 for a while. And then I really ramped it up. And let's say March and April, I made it like if I had any free time at all, that's all I did. And I think I finished the TTP course with some skimming, like I just mentioned, in about, I'll say about 350 hours.
Oh
And
wow.
really, the only other products I used were I bought some of the official guidebooks, and I would
Hmm.
continue using TTP, but that was a good way to get some quick questions in and learn.
Yeah.
There's slight differences in the verbiage and how the questions are phrased. So I think it was good to learn a little bit about how those questions are structured. But I saw a lot of advice of people using those products extensively and looking up all the answers on GMAT Club, which I definitely did, and it helped me. But I mean, 90% of my prep was TTP, and I don't regret that at all.
Yeah. Well, obviously you shouldn't.
Yeah.
You did tremendously well. And that's important. Following the study plan. I talk to people about this a lot. A lot of students reach out and ask. I mean, at a bare minimum, always following the study plan. Depending on where you're at in your prep, maybe there's some skimming that you can do, right? Like you did at the end, as you had, very good skills. So we give you everything, and then you kind of have to cut things out or skim through things or do a little less depending on where your skill level is. Now, if your skill level's low, it's clear. You just do the whole thing. If it's middle or higher, then you can make strategic decisions. So, um, So wow, 350 hours. And the cool thing that you mentioned um, is you were very strict, it sounds like, with your study schedule. And I say this to people a lot when I'm giving them advice on how to study, when to study. Like no one can say, hey, you need to study at this hour of this day, but you knew your schedule. Now, you were also in the military, so that probably kept you at a more, well, maybe not actually, because you said sometimes you have lunch and sometimes you don't. So you, it sounds like you had as an unpredictable schedule as anyone. But I'm also guessing you didn't have to cut things out of your life. Like I'm assuming you guys weren't going for happy hours on Friday, like you know, if you were working at an office. So if you're in that situation, yeah, you're going to have to make strategic decisions on things that you'll probably have to cut out during your preparation. But yeah, I like how you had a schedule. You would try to fit in the time when you could. 1 to 2 hours during the weekday is great. Um, Weekend study time is great. And look, everybody, like this is proof that if you can be disciplined, I think that's the key word. I'm sure you were motivated, but it sounds like more than anything, you were super disciplined with your prep. I mean, is that pretty accurate that basically you knew you had to do it, so you were more or less not really taking days off from this?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct, and I do agree that that keyword is discipline. You know, you also have to find a balance, which I hit a wall many times where I had to take a full day off or decide to call it earlier than I really wanted to. You have to know yourself. You know, for me, I would hit mental burnout sometimes and have to take the foot off the gas. But it's all about making time, and I sacrificed a lot during the prep, which is nothing big looking back. But you know, at the time, your friends are asking to go out. You got vacation plans, you got weekend
Right.
plans, and I had to say no about 100 times more than I wanted to, which definitely sucked in the moment. Didn't enjoy it, but it's for a greater goal. And in the grand scheme of things, 6 months of a little bit of reduced fun is well worth it if you get the score you want. I would just add like a cautionary tale of trying to limit your responsibilities and what you take on in addition to it. So for a long time, I've wanted to run a marathon. So I signed up for the Denver Marathon in May, which I did complete, but obviously that takes a lot of training.
Yeah.
And looking back, obviously it all worked out and I was lucky for that. But during the entire prep, I was like, this is such a mistake. You know, I've always liked working out, but this kind of 10 to 15 hours a week running, you know, both
Yeah.
the exhaustion that comes from that and then just the time commitment. I was like, this is not the right time in my life to make that decision. So I would just be careful with that, whether it's another part-time job, volunteering, working out. You know, you have to, I mean, depending on your level. For me, I really needed the hours studying. So everything else that was taken away with that became kind of a frustration. So I would just offer that as a cautionary tale. Just make sure how much you're taking on isn't going to interfere with your studying time or just put you in the hole.
Yeah, I agree. I think for a lot of people, it might take sitting down and really mapping out like what your responsibilities are in the bucket of, okay, I can't really get rid of these, my professional responsibilities, some of my family obligations, right? If you have those, and then all the other stuff. And yeah, I mean, no one's saying don't go to the gym, right? But if you go to the gym 5, 6 days a week, like maybe you're going to have to cut it back a little bit. That isn't
Absolutely.
the end of the world, right? Because as you said, it's 6 months, then you're back to normal if you do it right. Um, the worst thing is if you just kind of cut those things out halfway, so they're still like dribbling along, and you're like, but it's still not enough to move the needle for the GMAT. Then this thing gets prolonged, and certainly you don't want that. So that's really good advice. And we do have a question, and you can answer this. What is the hardest section of the GMAT? I mean, I guess that's between maybe parts of quant and or verbal. If you have any thoughts on that, I mean, and it's obviously from your perspective.
Yeah, so I always thought quant was the hardest. Obviously, I mean, you see the score up there, so nobody's, I guess, going to be surprised by that. But I will point out that I took two official practice tests and did get a quant 50 twice. So my quant was worse on the actual exam, kind of significantly than it was during my practice exams. But I always had a lot of problem with mental fatigue. And I guess this comes into like section order. I was doing quant first for a while because it's a weaker section, so I wanted to be fresh for it. That was my mindset, and I don't think you can really go wrong on the section order. It's really up to the person. But I realized that you kind of want to start, at least for me, with your strongest section, because for me it built confidence. So I knew like, okay, I did well on the verbal. Now I just have to get a decent quant score, and I'll probably get a good score. So really for me, it was the mental fatigue, like the back half of the quant section, especially if you're doing pretty well, you'll start to get the harder questions. For some reason, number lines and exponents, I'm still remembering these subjects that really, really trip me up. And I would be staring at the computer with just kind of nothing going on in my brain. I couldn't make myself focus. So I think taking those full length practice tests, studying for long interrupted periods of time. I think nowadays, a lot of people, including myself, you're always looking at your phone, all the instant gratification. It's very hard to, even if you're a naturally focused person, to sit down for hours and do nothing else. So for me, the hardest part of the GMAT was your mind wanders, maintaining that focus, and answering those difficult questions at the back half of the quant or verbal, whichever you do second. That was definitely the hardest part for me.
Yeah, it's funny because back when I was studying for the GMAT, it's making me sound like an old man, but God, what did I have? A BlackBerry at that point? Like, not even sure there were iPhones. So, yeah, you're right. I haven't even looked at it that way. That like because even obviously when in college too, like you dealt with this. You had an iPhone, so it's a totally different mentality. So you're right. It's almost like you need to turn the phone off, put it in another room, because if it's just in your desk drawer, you're probably
That's
just going to
exactly
pull
what
it
I
out of
did. Yeah.
you put it in another room.
Yeah, I turned it off
Yeah,
and I'd put it in my bedroom and I'd be like, 50 feet away at my desk studying.
right, exactly. Because otherwise, you're gonna be like, oh, I could take a small break, and
Yeah.
what happens is those small breaks of 5 to 10 minutes turn into 60, 70 minutes, and you're like, oh shoot, I should have been studying. So that is like really, really great advice. And something, yeah, I personally just didn't have to deal with when I was studying for the GMAT. Couple more questions. Some of these are maybe a little too specific. So I'll give you the ones that are less specific. Advice on perfecting sentence correction.
Yeah, so that's a great question because I really struggle with sentence correction. I was lucky to be strong in reading comprehension, but when it came to sentence correction, I was really confused. My number one piece of advice would be listen to like what TTP says about the strategy, because mastering the strategy of how to attack the questions is really what allowed me to perform well at it. Like narrowing down the answer choices is by far the most important aspect of sentence correction. Like don't try to guess the answer. Don't look at the whole passage and get confused at first. Just read the sentence and then just consider the first one. Is this definitely wrong? If it's definitely wrong, exit out. I'd always draw the 5 dashes for the
Yeah,
5 answer choices. And
right.
really, like you learn the rules that TTP teaches you about verb tense, all these rules. And I know a lot of people recommend like YouTube videos which show you the rules. Those can help too. I wouldn't obsess too much over the rules. You have to learn the big ones, and then really there's going to be 2 to 3 that are so obviously wrong that you can cross them out. And then you can take an educated guess if you really don't know. But it's really getting those 3 crossed off that are obviously wrong. And sentence correction is only about roughly 1/3 of the verbal section, right? So if you can get 2/3 of those right, and maybe 1 or 2 hard ones, like you can get a great verbal score without being particularly strong in sentence correction, in my opinion.
Right. In one thing of note for, new test takers, I mentioned this before, I'll just say it because it makes sense. The GMAT Focus doesn't have sentence correction. So
Right.
if you're considering that, like I said, we are launching ours today. So you'll notice in the study plan, there's no sentence correction. It's just critical reasoning and reading comprehension. So if you do struggle with sentence correction, and that's too big of a hurdle to get over, it's an option. So just keep that in mind. Um, Another question is, what do you recommend with someone struggling with comprehending logic and long, complex sentences in critical reasoning? Did you do anything special for critical reasoning as far as your process in solving those questions?
Yeah, I'll reiterate same thing about sentence correction, right? You got to cross off the obvious ones. But I'll say for critical reasoning and reading comprehension, this might be somewhat controversial advice, but I know it worked for me. I would just kind of go hand in hand with the lifestyle choices you might choose to make to help you perform better on the GMAT. You need to get good sleep, right? And a good way to get good sleep for me is reading before bed. So I would read before bed every night for about 30 minutes to an hour, and I'd pick something that was not easy to read novel, right? It'd be something rather dense. And then I'd
Right,
start my days instead of, I mean, I would still look at social media and all that, right? But I'd set
right.
aside 20 to 30 minutes to maybe read like the Wall Street Journal or something that's written in a way that's somewhat similar to these reading comprehension or critical reasoning passages. And for me, I was lucky that I didn't have to study any specific logical rules, but I think the more you expose your brain to that type of writing, to that dense and kind of somewhat not interesting at times writing, the less you're going
Hmm.
to get that fatigue where you're looking at these long sentences and these confusing answers and you're like, I don't know, because if your brain's doing it 2 to 3 hours a day over the course of months or even a year, like that compounds. So I would recommend that. That's what worked for me. But I was lucky to not have to study critical reasoning too much, in my opinion.
Oh, good. Yeah. I mean, I don't think that's controversial advice at all. I think that's fantastic. I mean, reading before bed is a good way to get your mind ready to go to sleep too. And yeah, reading all of those types of publications will get you used to it. Did you now when you did RC and CR, did you ever take notes in the I mean, obviously RC, there are longer passages. Did you take notes on either of them, both of them, one of them when going through them?
Um, Typically, no, except for sometimes those questions that are like all of the following strengthens the argument besides, or the double
Right.
negative questions. Those
Uh-huh.
sometimes really trip me up. So then I might have to write something down. And when I did take the GMAT, the real GMAT in a test center, I guess I didn't realize obviously how well I was doing, but the past or the last like 10 questions, I think I had two reading comprehension questions in the last 10, and they were very, very difficult and extremely dense. And I luckily had a lot of time, so I wrote down stuff for that. But I would generally advise against it if it's somewhat short. I think you just have to focus on crossing off the obviously wrong answers. But if it helps, it can't hurt. You just have to be wary of time management.
Yeah, sometimes I tell people to take notes, especially in reading comp, more so because just to make them an active reader. But it's interesting because it's the same thing you were talking about with some of these publications. So if you trained your mind to be able to focus and uh, kind of download the information that's coming at you through reading like things like the Wall Street Journal and other types of publications, then you were probably in that right mindset. Taking notes helps you affirm that you're actually doing it. Because if you're spacing as you're reading an RC passage, as you would imagine, like you'll get to the end and be like, oh gosh, I have no idea what I read. So part of it is just to keep your mind in check. But if you're able to do that through what you did preparing through reading those other things, then yeah, you probably didn't need to do that. Couple more questions. How many, well, you kind of answered this, daily in monthly study hours. I think you said around what, around 18 to 20 hours a week. Is that accurate?
Yeah, often it was a little bit less. I definitely had some weeks where I only got as little as like 8 hours, but and then it would fluctuate up to 20 plus. It was really as much as I could get in while still maintaining somewhat of a positive life. You know what I mean? Like sometimes you're
Yeah,
just studying so much, like I got to take a break because I'm just not going to make it in the long run. This is going to fall apart. So it's really,
right.
I'd recommend as much as you can handle, and that's definitely down to the individual, your work situation, your family life, whatever's going on. Yeah, it's very individually dependent, but I would say at least 10 hours a week, probably more towards like 15 or 20 would be better for most people.
Yeah, I think just being, as you said, well aware of burnout is key because like you it happens. I mean, don't use it as an excuse, but trust your mind. If you need a day off or you need, as you said, cut things short, don't ignore that, because if you get to a point of no return, you're just gonna not want to open your computer or whatever when you're doing your prep. Um, Someone asked, I mean, I think this goes without saying, the questions on the GMAT versus TTP questions, were they similar? I mean, given that you basically just use TTP, I think we can safely say that answer is a yes, based on your performance and
Yeah,
trying to get a
I would say
770.
yes, absolutely. They're similar. The hard questions in TTP, especially in the quant section, but definitely some of the sentence correction questions. I mean, and I think this is a huge positive for TTP personally. Like, they showed me questions that were harder than anything I've seen in the official guide, the 4 official mocks I took, or the actual GMAT itself, which is huge. And it also means, like, for me, I didn't get too down on myself when I was not doing well in the hard sections. And some of the quant chapters, I mean, I was getting like 20, 25%, right?
Yeah.
And I was able to get a quant 50 twice on the official mocks, right? So, I see a lot of people that are discouraged, that post on social media about, I only got 20 or only got 30% right on the hard. And I
Right.
would just say, like, try to understand the concepts, but don't get bogged down or down on yourself because you're not performing well, because the TTP difficult questions are seriously challenging.
Yeah, I say that all the time. It's not this exact science, right? If you get something wrong, you analyze why you got it wrong. You make improvements based on that. That's as good as anything, because you're using each question as a particular data point. And as long as you're taking advantage of that data point, you'll be fine. Now, yes, if you score zeros across the board, we have an issue, but yeah, you just got to learn from your mistakes, keep cruising, keep moving forward as you did. So yeah, that's also really good advice. Someone asked if we have a 1 month study plan. That's obviously a question for me. We do. I see it was put in the chat. Yeah, it's called the flexible learning plan, and it goes month to month. You just cancel it when you're done. Um, if you feel comfortable answering this, someone asked what schools you're applying to because you got such a great score. I don't know if you want to mention that or not. You don't have to if you don't.
Yeah, sure. I'm applying to Wharton, Columbia, Yale, Dartmouth, MIT, and Harvard for round 1. I think that's all I'm going to be able to handle. Maybe even not those schools for round 1, because
Right.
pretty quick turnaround. Round 1's pretty difficult.
Yes.
And then, depending on how those go, I might aim a little bit lower. I really want to live in the Northeast. It's where a lot of my friends and family are after graduation. I mentioned, I think before we started, that I wanted to work in management consulting. So all of those schools have great pipelines. I've got friends and family at a variety of those schools too. So it's going to be, all of them are reaches in some respect. Obviously the GMAT's good, but my GPA is pretty low, 3.00. So I'm gonna see what happens, but pretty open to different schools right now.
All right, cool. And now I feel like we just answered this. Someone said they're doing well in RC, but getting a lot more errors in CR. Do you have any tips? I do think you mentioned some of the things like reading other publications, very dense material, obviously getting through TTP. One thing I'll add is right now when practicing CR questions, like do them untimed. We say that a lot. I know it's a timed exam, but if you're just getting to the wrong answer quickly, that's an issue. So if you can spend 5 minutes on a question right now to really analyze it, see why the correct answers are correct, get that right. Obviously, with that repetition, you'll be able to get faster. So yeah, I wouldn't. So try that and see if that helps. And of course, if you're using TTP like Winslow did, get through the CR materials. Um, this is an interesting question. How stressful was your GMAT journey from beginning to end, would you say?
Yeah. I'd say out of 10, it was like about a 9 or a 10, right?
Oh
And
wow.
I'm more of a naturally anxious person, especially when it comes to like long-term goals,
Yeah.
and putting a lot of pressure on myself, which definitely is counterproductive at times. But I'll add a tip that's pretty obvious, but I think a lot of people ignore it, which is focusing on your sleep. And I've been someone who throughout my whole life, like I've always been very undisciplined about sleeping enough. I kind of just go to bed at whatever time. I'm decently good at powering through with little sleep, but uh, at the beginning of the GMAT journey, I kind of realized like this is a mental exam, and you need to be firing on all cylinders. So hand in hand with the reading every night would be, an hour before I wanted to go to bed to get 8 hours most nights. Put the phone across the room. I'd have my Kindle with like the warm light, but you could use a normal book, obviously, if that's what you choose to do. And I would just read, and that gets you pretty tired, along with making sure you're exercising and eating well. And then I realized when I was sleeping 7 or more hours a night, those difficult CR, RC questions, the tough quant concepts I had to learn, it came a lot easier, and I was able to manage stress so much better, because if I went out drinking or stayed up late, or got like 5 or 6 hours of sleep, I noticed I wasn't motivated to study. It took a
Right.
lot more discipline, and I was not able to learn new concepts well. So I would just really recommend that.
Right. And this is an interesting question, and something I was going to ask. So obviously, you learn a ton through TTP, the long study plan. We do have review tasks in the missions, but are you what did you do to review or to keep topics, top of mind that you had learned weeks or even months prior?
Yeah, great question. So I did all the reviews. I thought those were super helpful. Like a lot of people, was very nervous, especially when you get towards the end of like the quant section. You're like, do I really remember properties of numbers, or these chapters in the very beginning? So I made myself a couple custom review tests, and then I didn't take a mock until I was completely done with the TTP course. So I mentioned I started at 510. And then I took an official mock, which I was extremely nervous for, and was like, man, I just hope I'm close to 700, because that was my goal starting out. And it
Right.
was a 730. So I was really stunned and incredibly happy. But then I was like, I have 6 weeks until my exam. Like maybe I could score higher than this. So I reached out with like the TTP chat feature and got some advice from friends. And what I heard about was the streaks method, which I'll
Yeah.
probably summarize it pretty badly, but it's something TTP harps on a lot, which is picking a topic and drilling it so much that you can't get the easier medium questions wrong, roughly.
Right.
And so I did that. I went back and reviewed my tests, and also used like the TTP error log. And I was like, okay, what subjects am I weakest at? And I made a list, and it was like 14, right? So it took me a while to
Right.
go through, but that's all I did for 6 weeks. Was I just picked one, properties of numbers or this, and I'd make myself like a 50 question test. I go through the OG book and, pick that topic, and keep drilling it and trying to learn the fundamentals. And that's what drove my score up from 730 to 770 in about 4 weeks or 5 weeks. Yeah. So I think that was pretty successful for me.
That's great. Now, were you taking notes while you were, or not really, as you were working through it, or making flashcards or anything like that?
Absolutely making flashcards. Like I
Okay.
would, uh, everything that I was liable to forget, and especially obviously when you get to the geometry section, there are some formulas that you do need to memorize. It's really like one of the only sections. There's a few others, but it's really the only section where you like have to know, 10 or 15 new concepts definitely to perform well at it. So I remember like combinations and permutations. I could not remember the difference like for
Mm.
months. So I finally just like taped it up to my wall so I
That's
saw it
right.
every day.
Nice.
So if you're like me and you forget like dumb little things, I'd really recommend that strategy. Yeah.
Yeah, that's such a smart idea. I did stuff like that too. Did you use our, I think it was around when you were studying our flashcard tool that we launched, or were you just using your own?
Yeah, I definitely use the flashcard tool, and that's a great tool when you're short on time, especially just to keep
Yeah.
things fresh in your mind. So I had like 10 minutes, pull out the laptop, do some review, but really the physical flashcards for me, which never grew to more than 50, it was like the concepts that I couldn't remember and that were
Right.
super important, and I would look at those like maybe once or twice a week before bed, and I think that helped me a lot.
Yep. No, totally agree. And something else I wanted to get into, someone asked about it too. So, okay, you got through the learning phase in about 4 or 5 months, then you hit the practice test phase. I think you kind of just mentioned this. You took 4 exams, practice tests, that is. What were the scores of those? And I guess that means the practice test phase for you was about 5 weeks, right? Because you said you went from a seven. Okay. So what was, how did you kind of space those out? And if you recall, what were the scores from those?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, my first one was a 730. Super nervous about that. And as I got closer to the practice test phase, I was in such a rush to be done with the concepts because I understood very well, like, you can't take the test and get a full reading of your score until you've at least been exposed to all the concepts and you know what you need to improve on, right? So I was kind of rushing through and I was super nervous, very happy with the 730. And the next weekend, I was like, the anxiety was creeping in. Oh, what if that was a fluke? Like, what if that's easier than the real one? I was kind of psyching
Right.
myself out. I took another
Yep.
one. You got the exact same score, 730. So that kind of put my mind at ease a little bit. And then due to work and life circumstances, I couldn't take another one for 3.5 weeks. So I did the streaks method. I focused on the weakest points. And once again, I was super nervous going into it. I was like, what if I've lost? I didn't practice any verbal. I didn't do any comprehensive review. I was just focusing on these concepts. What if I've lost it? And I got the 770 on that. And I was once again stunned. And then once again, nervous that it was a fluke. So I took it about 4 days before the exam for the last time, got another 770. And at that point, I was like, okay, as long as this real test isn't hugely different from the practice test, I think I'm going to score above a 750. And obviously I was still super happy when those numbers flashed up at the end. So it was stressful. Practice test phase was not easy for me, but I trusted the process and it definitely worked out.
Yeah. Well, that's another thing that's worth mentioning is like, and you did it, and it's easier said than done. But I tell students, especially that I work with closely, when they do score well on a practice exam, like take the win, like don't, we don't want to justify why you got a 730. And while you're doing it, think to yourself, well, that's a lot better than me having to justify why I got a 630, So it means, as you now know, you improved and that was a true score. So yeah, for anyone out there who's in that phase, don't second guess those scores. If you're doing them under realistic conditions, they're official practice exams. I mean, yes, keep taking more, obviously, but give yourself some credit. Like obviously you were doing well, and that's why you scored a 730. No other reason than that. And yeah, so Winslow didn't take any other practice exams. He just did the 4 official mocks, like we said. So yeah, I mean that's pretty much. I mean, this is all really, really good information. I mean, as you guys can see, Winslow, I mean, he got TTP. He did everything we asked him to do in the study plan, more or less. He worked hard. He had discipline. He trusted his mind and his gut and his mentality if he needed days off, and he got the job done in about 350 hours in 6 months. So for any of you guys watching it, know that you can do the same thing. I mean, I think you said your first practice test was a 5 to 510. So I mean, we're talking about a 280-point increase in 6 months. So it's doable. But you got to be disciplined, and as you said, Winslow, you got to trust the process and know that you're doing the right things. Do you have any sort of final words of wisdom for those out there, looking to pick up in their journey, or maybe in the midst of it and maybe need a little bit of motivation?
Yeah, I would say that helpful for me, might be helpful for some other people, is that this test is about, it was for me throughout the whole process and during the exam, controlling your anxiety. The official mocks are an extremely good, like spot on representation of how you're going to do on the real thing. So don't psych yourself out like I did. What you score is probably roughly about what you're going to score on the GMAT when you go take it in a test center or online. And week to week, month to month, it's about managing your expectations, not letting your mind wander to the future or stress yourself out, just focus on the task at hand. That was invaluable to me. So it's the small decisions you make every day and how you're sleeping, how you're managing your stress, how you're studying. That's what leads you to success over the period of weeks and months.
Yeah, that's great advice because this is a long process. You have to be ready for it. So yeah, and then there you go. The end result is a 770. So yeah, before we let everybody go, once again, if you enjoyed, this interview, please like the video and feel free to leave comments for the folks over at GMAT Club. And again, if you're considering GMAT or GMAT Focus, check out TTP. I will say again that we are launching our GMAT Focus course today. So it'll have, everything you need. Obviously, the math and verbal is there, and then the data insights. So you can toggle back and forth between the two tests for free. This isn't a separate cost or anything, and you can view it during our 5-day trial. So Winslow, thank you for today. This was great. I hope everyone got some nuggets of information from it. He rocked the GMAT 770, Verbal 51, Q47. So I see we've covered everybody's questions. So yeah, thanks again, Winslow. And I'm sure you guys will be seeing me soon. So have a good day, everybody. And I'll see you guys soon.
Thanks, Jeff.